It is my pleasure to welcome Richard Sandell, Director and Head of the Department of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester, a museum studies program dedicated to promoting social inclusion and with a PhD program. In the last 15 years, Dr. Sandell has been a champion of human rights in museums. In eloquent but direct and persuasive prose, Dr. Sandell's many publications, but most particularly his 2000 book, Museums, Prejudice, and the Reframing of Difference, and his 2002 edited volume, Museum, Society, Inequality, both published by Routledge, have inspired readers to work for a more ethical museum. Undoubtedly, his forthcoming co-edited volume, Representing Disability, Museums and the Politics of Display, will make an equally significant contribution. Dr. Sandell grounds his theoretical precepts in practice gained from his early years as marketing manager for the Nottingham City Museum and Art Galleries, where he worked to diversify and develop museum audiences. Last year, he co-edited a volume with Robert Janes, Museum Management and Marketing for Routledge, on which he drew from those experiences. To support his research, Dr. Sandell has been awarded numerous fellowships. For example, in 2004, he was a fellow in museum practice at the Smithsonian Institution, and earlier this year, he was a visiting fellow at the Humanities Research Center of the Australian National University. Dr. Sandell has worked with both the AAM and the Museums Association of the UK on diversity task forces. He is on the editorial panel of two international peer-reviewed journals, Museums and Society, and the Journal of Museum Management and Curatorship. And until recently, he sat on the advisory panel of Museum Practice. In 2006, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. At Leicester, Dr. Sandell teaches master's and PhD students in both campus-based and distance learning programs. He teaches museum management and marketing in courses including leadership, organizational change, human resource management, and audience development. Please help me in welcoming Richard Sandell.
Well, good morning. It's really great to be here, and that voting technology is very impressive. I've never seen that before, but a little bit worried. I was told before I came on you might be able to use it in a kind of X Factor talent contest voting style to boo me on or off, so I'll do my best not to disappoint. But it's really terrific to be here, and very many thanks to Janet and to Susan and Petra and all her colleagues here at Seton Hall. And I do think the Institute is a very significant, a very timely development for the sector, and one which we'll watch very closely from with a lot of interest from the UK. And it's very exciting for me to be part of this inaugural event. So many thanks for the invitation. A slight change of title to the talk, and probably got my work cut out for me, given the 50-50 split on the last question, because I'm exploring the relationship between ethics and activism. But probably in the interests of transparency, which would be appropriate in a conference of this kind, I should say that my intention is to really lend support for and argue for the importance and the value of an activist approach to ethical museum practice, and hopefully that will come a little bit clearer as we move through. Over the last 12 months, 9 different interpretive experiments have opened in museums and galleries across the UK. Very, very different in terms of the collections that they draw upon and the different modes of interpretation that they adopt. A range of different projects. So there are exhibitions and displays, films, educational sessions for school children. So kind of very different in that sense, but all sharing a single common goal. Each of the projects is designed to challenge, to unravel stereotypes around disability, to explore new ways of representing disability related narratives, and to engage visitors in debates current, contemporary, often quite difficult debates about disability and disability rights. And ultimately, our aim in each of those projects is to challenge, to enrich, to inform visitors' thinking. So it has that activist underpinning, if you like. This project can be seen as part of a broader resurgence of interest in the 21st century in museum practice, which emphasises social responsibility and explores the social value and agency of museums. More museums than ever before express their support for the principle of access for all. More museums are exploring in very creative and innovative ways, ways in which they can respond to and contribute to a more just and equitable society. But these trends in practice, these progressive trends in practice, have not gone unchallenged. And indeed, I think there are, I'm very worried about some signs which I see in various places, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, but worrying signs that competing views and visions of what museums are for, what they should be doing, are emerging and are threatening, I think, in some places to undermine ethical practice in our institutions, and I'll return to that in a moment. So my presentation is in two parts today. I'm going to firstly review some of that backlash against these trends towards more accessible, inclusive, socially responsible institutions. And in the second part of my paper, I'm going to come back to that project I began with around disability and really unpick some of the ethical challenges that were presented to us in developing that project. Some of those are very specific to my own project on disability, but many of them really should resonate, I think, with other projects that have similarly activist ambitions that are trying to contribute towards social change. Just to say something briefly then about these trends which have generated the backlash I'm going to come to. Maybe even 30 years ago, efforts to try and reach audiences that generally don't visit museums were the preserve, I think, a minority of very pioneering institutions. And I think, the last 30 years have really changed that, and we can see most museums making some kind of effort to reach non-traditional audiences. And we can debate the extent to which that has been successfully embedded within our institutional practices. But nevertheless, that increasingly widespread concern of the principle of access for all has had a phenomenal impact on our profession. And we can see access codified within ethical documents, and we can see revised definitions of museums from AAM and ICOM and the Museums Association in the UK, which really try and embody that principle of access and the need to broaden and reach new audiences. And alongside that increasing interest in who visits, who participates, there's similarly a growing interest in developing more pluralist, more inclusive narratives within our museums. The result of, I think, a growing influence of human rights discourse and thinking. The new social movements of the latter part of the 20th century have seen greater efforts to represent women, indigenous people, minority ethnic communities in more equitable ways, and perhaps less work in some other areas around faith and sexual minorities and disabled people, but nevertheless a real effort towards those more culturally pluralist narratives. And lastly, I would say, whilst those first two areas have been, I think, really very widespread, there's also perhaps a more smaller specialist emergence of museums that have really taken social responsibility to the core of their institution and have looked beyond their four walls at ways of addressing, responding to wide-ranging social, cultural, environmental inequalities that different communities are facing. So those trends have been absolutely significant, and not surprisingly, they have generated a very powerful backlash from some quarters. And as I said, I'm very worried about some of these, the kind of growing support for some of these competing ways of thinking about museum purposes and practice. To the extent I think there might be, and I'd be interested to hear from you about your experiences here in the States, but certainly there is a sense in the UK, maybe a swinging of the pendulum. At the Museums Association conference in Liverpool just last month, even there was talk really of, a few speakers talked about the battle having been won, that we're all committed to access and inclusion, and we can in some ways turn our attention to different agendas, and I find that a worrisome trend, which we'll come back to. So I have just a handful of quotations which are from various sources, mainly from the UK, but I gather from colleagues over here that some of the ideas are certainly echoed in debates that are taking place over here. So we'll have a look at some of them. Josie Appleton from an organisation called the Institute of Ideas wrote this in 2004. Over the past 10 to 15 years, the face of museums has changed beyond recognition. Out has gone the focus on the collection, study and display of artefacts. Instead, we've seen museums reinvent themselves as social missionaries, getting involved in building communities, improving mental health and educating children, as if these are quite bizarre things for museums to do. Other museums have reposed themselves as businesses, developing a brand and working to give customers what they want. Rows of stuffed animals have been replaced by interactive machines, and scholarship has given way to outreach work. Minette Marin is a journalist for a broadsheet newspaper in the UK. 8 years ago, she wrote, "With quite astonishing arrogance, the government's Department of Culture, Media and Sport has just issued a truly shocking threat to this country's leading art galleries and museums. If they don't increase their numbers of ethnic visitors in line with strict quotas, they may lose their funding." Mark Wallinger, some of you may know, is a very well-known contemporary artist who wrote, "I think the enemy of creativity is society's obsession with accessibility and education in museums and galleries. It's a kind of desperate notion that somehow you've got to meet people halfway. Art can be very difficult, and why shouldn't it be?" Just a couple more. James Keynote, art museum director. "How can we direct visitors' attention to the art with just enough assistance to help them, but with not so much that we limit their responses? I would suggest that we could begin by clearing away some of the clutter in our museums, the many distractions we've introduced into them, the commercial, the alimentary, the promotional, the entertaining, and even to the extent that it comes between the viewer and the work of art, the educational." The last one then, another journalist just a couple of years ago. "Arts funding that might once have been spent acquiring a particularly fine Stubbs or a rare medieval manuscript is now diverted towards fashionable campaigns to coax more ethnic minorities up the steps of the National Gallery, or on community projects to help the homeless or the mentally ill feel better about themselves. Greater access and education may not in themselves be unworthy aims, but to emphasise them at the expense of museums' core function is to miss the point completely. Without the stimulus of new collections, museums become moribund, and who will want access to a museum that's dead?" I still find many of these statements deeply offensive to the work that many people do in museums and galleries, and I think it's tempting to dismiss them outright. Certainly some of them can be seen, I think, as very ill-informed, reactionary, purposefully polemical comments, but others, I think, articulate a position which can enjoy quite considerable support within the sector and can be quite persuasive. And I think it's worth just taking a few moments to unpick some of those comments. Many of them set up false oppositions between, they set up that either or thinking and pit one way of thinking against another, which is very often misleading, and inaccurate. So inclusion is set up against core activities, and inclusion is seen as something which is entirely new. In the UK, it's often blamed on a New Labour government and ignoring the kind of historical roots of museums' concern with social issues and social change, but often pitted against each other as competing. Audiences, that kind of old cliche is really rehashed in many of those comments. Audiences pitting, the needs of audiences being pitted against the needs of collections as if they're somehow always mutually exclusive. Scholarly research is set up against social engagement, and those are things which I find so frustrating when I think some of the most exciting work and lots of exciting initiatives that you'll hear about from other speakers in this conference today are really blending very significant research into both collections and ideas, and also into audiences and communities. And that social engagement is not something which is separate. It's very much bringing those two areas together. One which I'm going to return to later on in relation to my own project is that idea that anything to do with education, access and inclusion is about delimiting the visitors' responses. It's about closing down the way in which people might approach something. So, it's seen as a way, as being pitted against that inspirational or inspiring experience which is so valuable in museums. And again, I think an entirely false opposition. Several of the statements use quite seductive language to that really you have to look more closely at the motivations and thinking that underlie them. I'm thinking there of the James Keynote comment. If you think about who wouldn't want to remove something like clutter from our galleries? It sounds like a very something we could all buy into, to have this negative thing, clutter, removed, and restore this kind of very pure experience in the museum, until you realise that also includes, in that particular quote, educational or interpretive interventions which are seen as a barrier, not a bridge to understanding, and really fundamentally miss the whole point about some of that work. I think underlying all of those statements is the idea of there is a real resistance to any framework of accountability for museums. There's a belief that museums should be free to somehow autonomously pursue their agendas without accommodating, without taking account of broader patterns of social and cultural inequality in the context within which museums operate. So, for example, any biases in patterns of participation, with certain groups making better use of museums than others, is explained totally in terms of people's personal preferences. They choose not to visit, denying those multiple barriers which we all know exist, barriers which prevent people, sometimes tangible physical barriers, other times more invisible barriers that prevent many groups from participating fully in our cultural institutions. Similarly, biases in the kind of material that we collect and display and how we display that is seen to be somehow separate, to not have any relationship to those broader patterns of inequality. So that resisting that whole notion of accountability, which is of course absolutely central to ethics that we're here to discuss today. Those comments do reflect a different views on the extent to which museums should be accountable. Writers like Gary Edson and Tristram Besterman, who've written about museum ethics, highlight the fact that not exactly unique, but a very particular challenge that museum has is that we have such diversity of stakeholders, each with different agendas, that inevitably generates some of those ethical challenges where these competing agendas, these competing interests can come together. And this ethics of accountability is central to what I want to go on to talk about. However, because museums have different stakeholders with different agendas to juggle need not reduce them to being simply responsive to those agendas. And indeed, Tristram Westerman argues, he says, museums are places of creative interaction in which traditional values and orthodoxies can and should be challenged. An ethical museum should be free to surprise and to do the unexpected. And it's to this idea of museums as places where some of those competing interests and agendas can and should be challenged that I now want to turn in the second half of my paper. Museums have a very complicated relationship with morality, with moral codes and conventions that exist within the communities and societies that they operate. Museums are undoubtedly, they do reflect dominant moral codes, dominant ways of thinking about things. They certainly do reflect the power base within different communities. But increasingly, there's a growing body of research and evidence and support for the idea that museums, of course, don't simply reflect those moral positions, but they are generative, they play an active part in shaping and reshaping those moral positions. There is a social agency in museums that has social effects and consequences. And we see, a number of museums really embracing that in their core, and some of the work that I've written about before, museums that have the combating of prejudice at their absolute core, that's their central rationale, is based on the idea because they embrace that view that they can take on a particular moral standpoint and look to ways to build support for that. Of course, at the same time, we might have a growing confidence in museums in expressing their ability to contribute towards social change. But we also know that audiences don't just visit and take away the message that we want them to take away. Museums are, of course, active in constructing their own meaning. They bring their own values and beliefs and cultural baggage with them, which they bring to bear on the ideas that they find in museums. And however clear a museum might be about its moral standpoint, there is still the potential for visitors to create their own very different meanings. But having said that, again, research here in the States and back in Europe has found time and time again that museums have very particular characteristics as knowledge providers. They are seen as more trustworthy than most other sources of information, the internet, newspapers, television. They're seen as less biased, more credible, more trustworthy. And that, I think, brings particular responsibilities and opportunities that we can take up as well. I've argued previously, and just to reiterate now, that museums can frame, inform and enable the conversations which society has about difference. I think they frame those conversations by virtue of what they choose to engage with and what they choose to overlook. They inform people's conversations because there's, again, a growing body of evidence which shows the effects of a museum visit on people's thinking and the way they talk and understand particular issues. Museums do inform the way people think about things. And they also increasingly enable those conversations. They actually host the conversations and debates. They are places in which people can discuss and take forward some of these ideas. But this conception of the museum as a site of moral activism, as a site in which is not simply reflective of dominant moral codes and conventions, but is increasingly concerned with reconfiguring and reshaping those moral positions, of course, generates a multitude of ethical dilemmas and challenges which practitioners in many parts of the world are grappling with. And I want to look at two of those now and use the lens of our particular project around disability to try and illustrate how we grappled with some of these questions. In particular, what moral frameworks do we have that we can draw upon for guidance in negotiating this contested terrain? What kind of sources of ethical moral guidance might we be able to draw upon to take up some of these activist positions? and what modes of interpretation are most likely to engender support amongst visitors for those principles of equity, fairness, human rights that we're trying to build support for? What are the kind of ways of communicating and ways of engaging visitors that are likely to help us in that mission? So the 9 projects with which I began this presentation come under the banner of a project I've had the pleasure to work with colleagues on in the University of Leicester's Research Centre for Museums and Galleries, RCMG. And the project's called Rethinking Disability Representation, and the biggest, most ambitious project we have taken on in the centre to date. We had over £500,000, mainly from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and also with support from the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and some from our own university. £500,000 to develop new ways in which museums can represent disabled people and engage visitors in debates around disability. We chose to work with 9 partner museums on the project. It was an action research project, so what we wanted to do was develop practice in partnership with 9 museums. And they were wide-ranging from small volunteer-run museums, local history museums, through to nationally funded museums like the Imperial War Museum. Absolutely central to our project was what we called a think tank of disabled activists and artists and cultural practitioners, a group of disabled people who would work very closely with the museums over a 2-year, in a very immersive, in-depth way to help develop and shape the content and the tone of the different interpretive projects, the exhibitions, displays, the films and so on that emerged 2 years later and have opened all in the last year. We wanted to purposefully inform contemporary debates. We wanted to engage visitors in thinking about the present day, the ways to question their own attitudes about disability and their own views and opinions on rights-related debates. And lastly, just to say, Rethinking Disability Representation grew out of an earlier project which was looking at researching collections. We did a survey of museums and galleries across the UK to look at what material existed in collections that could be used to tell stories around disability, because we were interested in the fact that at a time when museums were increasingly looking to explore hidden histories, to develop more pluralist narratives, why was the lives of disabled people and why was disability-themed content very often overlooked? And we wondered to the extent to which some of that material had or hadn't been collected. So I've got a few slides just to show you about, we found hundreds, we found thousands of objects. We found objects in every collection of any size that we looked in, whether it was a fine art, decorative art, social history, archives, Egyptology, ethnography, anthropology, a whole range of collection types, all contained material which was relevant to disability. It was very often not displayed. If it had been displayed, its connection with disability was rarely made explicit to the visitor. And just to give you a flavour of some of that material, some of it was quite expected. This is a wheelchair from the Royal London Hospital Museum and Archive. So there were places where you might expect to find some of that material. This was a particularly interesting one for me. It's a self-portrait of the artist Sarah Biffin. You can see the paintbrush strapped to her right shoulder. And it was, Janet mentioned I used to work in Nottingham City Museums and Art Galleries, and that was a museum that was really very interested and committed to hidden history programs back in the 80s and 90s. And it's interesting that we had this in our collections. I've never actually seen the original. It came to light from my point of view after I'd moved to Leicester. And we were interested in what a fantastic image, what an amazing story that image tells. And it's intriguing, it became intriguing to us why, even in a place like Nottingham where we'd been doing a lot of work, particularly around other hidden histories, why this hadn't been displayed. The label at the bottom there just reads, Boots Worn by Arthur Cayley, the Manx Giant. We found quite a lot of material that related to local characters or people who had appeared in 19th century freak shows by virtue of their physical differences. Contemporary art, this is a sculpture of Catherine Long by Mark Quinn that was in a collection at the Pump Rooms in Leamington. Thousands of objects at the National Maritime Museum relating, to, amongst others, to Nelson. This was a great image in a photographic archive for Whitby Museum, one of the 9 museums we later worked with. The character on the left is Robert Stumper Dryden, who was an active part of that fishing community. The photographer, Frank Meadows Sutcliffe, his work is all over Whitby if you get a chance to visit that village, but this particular image, again, hadn't been displayed, and we wanted to bring that out of the stores and do some work on that. So, thousands of objects, as I've said, rarely displayed or rarely displayed in a way where their connection to disability was made known. And we wanted to find out why, and we interviewed a lot of curators in UK museums, and a whole set of concerns and anxieties emerged from those interviews. There was a real openness to displaying and interpreting some of that material, but really concerns about getting it wrong, offending visitors, offending both disabled and non-disabled visitors. There was a couple of curators invoked that idea of the shadow of the freak show and not wanting to recreate that freak show interpretation of putting people, emphasising people's physical differences and putting them on display. The new book project that Janet mentioned we're working on with Rosemary Garland-Thompson from the States, who has written quite a lot about staring. And she says the one thing we all know about staring is that our mum told us not to stare. And yet if you think about what we were trying to do to address that invisibility of disabled people in museums, of course, the idea about staring, looking intently for a long period of time at our displays is a real sign of success. It's something we want to encourage and see. It shows that we've really engaged people. How could some of those tensions be reconciled? Curators also mentioned they did have material in their collections, and we helped them uncover some of that could lend itself to quite a celebratory narrative, like many other hidden histories where the idea that you can celebrate the many contributions that a particular community have made to society. There was that kind of material, but there was also much more worrying, much more potentially disturbing, unsettling material that told of stories of pain and disempowerment and oppression. And again, people were worried about how to deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of what we set out to do, working with those 9 partner museums, working with our think tank of activists and artists to shape new forms of interpretation. I haven't got time today to go through all 9, but I'm going to give you a sample of some of them and use them then to explore some of these ethical challenges in the time that I have left. Colchester museums have done really interesting work in this field, and they developed an exhibition, a touring exhibition called Life Beyond the Label, which drew on their collections. They also did work with artists, and it was playing on that idea about not just museum labels, but the labels that are used to categorise, to name, often in a pejorative way, disabled people. And part of that project was here with these disabled individuals choosing their own terms that related to their own identities. A touring temporary exhibition then at Colchester Museums. The Imperial War Museum was the one project. It didn't do exhibitions or displays, but instead chose to develop a series of very rich educational resources for secondary school children, and they looked again at the fantastic archives and collection in the Imperial War Museum to examine the relationship between war and conflict and disability, but to use that with school children to enable school children to reassess and think their own attitudes towards disability and disabled people. And some very, very powerful sessions. And at the more informal gathering we had last night, I talked about some of the responses that some of the school kids had to those really fantastic sessions. Lives in Motion was an exhibition, a temporary exhibition. It's going to become part of a permanent display in a new museum in Glasgow, the Riverside Museum. But the Museum of Transport looked at the significance of transport and accessibility for all of our lives. One of the really interesting things the think tank said over that 2-year development stage, some of them said, you know, this can all become very serious and worthy. Can you explore opportunities for humour in your project where appropriate? And Glasgow really took that to heart, and Glaswegians have renowned for a very dry sense of humour, and there are some fantastic stories in there. You can just about see, I think, this is so-called noddy car that transformed many people's lives when it became available, but was really, really dangerous. They used to tip over, you weren't allowed to take passengers in with you, but the picture set against the huge photograph at the back is of a football match, and you can see the cars are lined up right on the side of the pitch, and the narrative, the story that goes with this from the guy who used to drive one said, you know, you weren't allowed to take passengers, but you used to smuggle your friends in under a blanket because you got this fantastic ringside view of the football match, and everyone would cheer you when you came in. He said it was like being, you know, Ben-Hur in some kind of gladiatorial ring. So there were really funny stories that were going in there as well, but with a very serious idea as well. That one of the first things that you learned when you went into the exhibition was that if you are a wheelchair user in the UK, you have to give 24 hours notice to use public transport, which was something which is unnecessary and was there to sort of designed to kind of highlight the many barriers which exist for disabled people. Okay. So these very purposeful attempts to change the way people might think about disability, to directly challenge the very prevalent, dehumanising, demeaning stereotypes which are very common in a whole range of media, inevitably created a multitude of ethical challenges. Some of them, as I've said, specific to disability, and others I think will chime with other attempts to other projects that have some of these activist ambitions. And I'm going to just run through 4 of these particular challenges. I'll take each one and I'll use a very particular example from Rethinking Disability Representation to show you how we worked to overcome some of those. I've talked about the kind of what sources of ethical and moral guidance are there to support practitioners in developing some of this work. We looked at the disability rights movement, at the disabled people's movement, and the literature in disability studies to help ground and guide our approach to dealing with some of this material. And in particular, those of you might be familiar with this, but the disability studies and the disability rights movement has used a social model of disability as a way of better understanding disability, and that has been taken up and used to develop more progressive, more rights-based ways of understanding disability. The social model argues that the issue, that disability, it locates it in society instead of with the individual body and their impairment. It argues that society disables people by virtue of the many barriers, physical, attitudinal, and so on, that it puts in place. And that really, it really helped. We used that as a guiding principle throughout all of the 9 projects, and the activists and artists that we work with were very committed to this social model. And it is one that's increasingly debated, but nevertheless does enjoy a lot of support amongst activists, policymakers, and so on in the disability field. And we use that to help frame each of our projects. This second dilemma then, if you think back to that earlier comment when I was looking at the backlash about the idea that some of this work, it's argued, is too didactic, it delimits the way in which people might look at something. It's about telling people what to think, it's moralizing, it's narrow, and it closes down people's ways of thinking. I very strongly argue against that. We were very, very concerned, and we felt it was entirely possible to blend a strong moral standpoint with a way of interpreting which opened up possibilities rather than closed them down. And we drew very heavily on practice here in the States from National Museum of American History and the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Tenement Museum, amongst others, to look at how that can be achieved. So just one example of, we ended up with one of our exhibitions creating discussion areas here where people's comments were invited, and we elicited people's opinions, and often a very lively debate would occur in those particular areas. Inevitably, work of this kind that's dealing with rights can generate instances where the rights of one group are seen to impinge on the rights of another. By way of example, one of our projects was called Talking About Disability and Art, which was at Birmingham Museums and Art Gallery. We had a number of paintings that had depictions of disabled people or had a relationship to disability content in these paintings, and we left them in situ but developed these audio points that you can see here. And you can see there are a number of buttons that this visitor can press. You can press the first button and hear a more standard curatorial account of interpretation of that work, or there are other buttons to press. And one of them will give you, Birmingham Museums invited local disabled artists and professionals in to give their own responses to the paintings and to draw connections between themes and ideas in some of those historic scenes and their own personal experiences today. There was also another button which meant some of those artists had given their own very personal poetic response to some of the pictures. I'm going to just play, it's just 2 minutes long, the audio extract by one of those artists to this picture of the Finding of the Saviour in the Temple by Holman Hunt. A number of the paintings that had depictions of disabled individuals within them were religious themed. There are biblical scenes or had otherwise religious content, and that generated very strong feelings amongst some members of the group. And you'll hear now if this works. Okay.
The Finding of the Saviour in the Temple. My name is Dr. Paul Dark. I'm a disabled writer and artist. I established the Wolverhampton Disability Festival and have my own radio show on WCR-FM, a community radio station serving the city of Wolverhampton. Recently, I was sitting in my wheelchair in Boots, the chemist, patiently waiting to be served at the Bay Hair desk, and an elderly woman approached me. Nothing unusual there, I thought. I am often the recipient of witticisms about being in a wheelchair. This was different. The elderly woman put her hand on my head and said, "I shall pray for you and your father. A father's sins have made you this way." She took her hands off my head and sauntered away. I was neither surprised nor baffled. After all, I had been to a special school for people with spina bifida, a Christian faith school where we had to read and were read the Bible daily. No TV on a Sunday, only church. My religious schooling has often made me feel that disabled people are exploited by ordinary people in the furtherance of their own religious beliefs. The school was a Lord Shaftesbury school, a man who could have seen this painting as he died in 1885. Holman Hunt's The Finding of the Saviour in the Temple explores Christian faith through its symbols, signs and metaphors. The painting, for me, symbolises the relationship between Christianity and disability. I feel disability is seen in two ways. Firstly, as something that can be healed by faith, and secondly, that it can be exploited as a route into heaven by helping disabled people, just like in my childhood. This view sees me, my body, myself, as little more than a metaphor or an example of God providing an opportunity for believers to become closer to Him. Within this view, I, the disabled, have little merit or worth as a whole human being in myself. I am, as the blind and the crippled are, in Holman Hunt's painting, peripheral to the real drama of normal life. I have to endure the denial of disabled people's value as extraordinary human beings. I like the painting because it explains to me the history of this view of disabled people, but it depresses me at the same time because it suppresses me. I take away from the painting the message that there is no future for disabled people outside of the oppressive practice of charity. I am not anti-religion of any kind. I merely object to religion's uncritical exploitation of disability. I feel this painting reinforces to a non-disabled audience the righteousness of the dominance of the normal over the abnormal. It indicates the place of disabled people as second-class citizens and the rightness of seeing me as less than you.
Okay, so just one of a number of interpretations of that painting, and those very strong feelings did generate a lot of discussion within the museum, who were, of course, and rightly anxious not to offend Christian visitors and wanted to unpick and explore some of those ideas. In the end, that interpretation was included and went ahead. It's clear to visitors that it is one interpretation of that painting that sits alongside others within the gallery, and was deemed an appropriate way of critiquing some of those views and ideas. Okay, we need to make up a little bit of time, and I'm just going to pull this to a close. The last challenge that I was going to pick up was about some of that material which was deemed to be rather unsettling, the difficult stories that that material would tell. How would people respond to that? Our think tank were absolutely adamant that alongside that more celebratory narratives, there should be stories which told of the very real stories of pain and loss and disempowerment. We don't have time to show this particular clip, but one of our projects was a film by the filmmaker David Heavey, who worked with the Royal London Hospital Museum and Archives to reinterpret the story of Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. The museum holds the collections relating to the Elephant Man, and that generates a lot of interest amongst visitors. This film, though, it's just the full version is 20 minutes long, and it's available off our RCMG website. I'll get Janet to see if we can put up a link maybe on the IME website if people are interested in watching it. But it really explores similarities for some disabled people today about the experience of being stared at, for example, and interprets that using the objects and the material from the museum in a very, I think, a very unconventional and quite unsettling way that has divided people who've watched that. They have found it quite a powerful way to unsettle some of their ideas. Okay, we're going to just skip to the conclusion then, rather than show that clip. Over the I said then that my goal was to lend support to that idea of activist practice, which I see as a desire to a purposeful, a thoughtful, reflexive desire to bring about a more just, equitable, respectful society. And I think the important developments we've seen around access and inclusion and so on over the last few years have been really, really significant. They have made tremendous differences to our profession. And at the same time, as museum studies, the field of museum studies has grown, we now have a huge, growing, burgeoning body of evidence which helps us understand the social roles and responsibilities and opportunities of museums better than we ever have before. And I think that body of evidence enables us to, it equips us to tackle some of that backlash that we've talked about, because it shows that some of these initiatives are not simply, the views of a few left-wing practitioners. In fact, they grow out of a much better understanding of the fact that what museums choose to do, who they choose to engage with, does have social effects and consequences. And I would use that to argue that some of this activist practice should really move from the periphery to the core and the centre stage of much of our museum work. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions or comments on any aspect of that?
There's a really brilliant book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, and it's a critique of sort of the nonprofit industrial complex that sort of runs much of the sort of museum world and also nonprofits in general in the United States because of what is perceived as really restrictive 501c3 rules and regulations, which say that you're not allowed to advocate for politicians or particular public policy. And so I guess I'm wondering, in your really provocative presentation, I love everything you're saying. I agree that we should be involved in activism, but I'm wondering how you define activism, and is there's a point where, for example, if you were a museum that dealt with gay, lesbian history, how much should you engage, for example, Prop 8 in California or not, as a public institution? And I think the question of sort of internationalizing this conversation is very interesting, because I'm wondering what are the rules that sort of govern sort of nonprofits in the UK that maybe we can also learn from here in the States.
Thank you. And I think they're absolutely, I've got no straightforward answer to that, because they are really thorny problems, aren't they? I would say it seems that as a sector, we're more comfortable taking up an activist position on some issues than others. So it's seen, I think, certainly in some of my research would show that it's not seen so problematic to take up, to try and change people's behaviours about recycling in view of climate change. So to take up that kind of activist position in relation to the environment, I'm sure there's much more that we could do in that field, and there's some really pioneering work in museums, but it's not, it's seen quite natural, I think, for some science or natural history institutions to take up that role. But when you look at issues around promoting kind of equality agendas, people get suddenly quite anxious. And some of the curators that we interviewed said, this is not what museums are about. We can't kind of ram this down people's throats. This is, it is advocacy, it's inappropriate, it's impartial. And so we really had to unpick over quite a long period of time that idea about no neutral position, and the fact we were talking yesterday at yesterday evening's event. I was talking about Colchester Museum that we work with. The director there was saying we've got these, they have fantastic Roman remains, Roman collection, and they've recreated a Roman street scene, but it's peopled totally by, 6 foot tall, kind of buff individuals that bear no relationship to actual historical accuracy or truth or what people would have looked like at that time. And that kind of argument really then got to some of the curators, because they were trying to see about how, they took some of those ideas about being truthful and representative very, very seriously. Other ways, I think it's interesting how we treat certain subjects differently. And you mentioned kind of gay and lesbian histories. That's been problematic, fascinating really, that under the Conservative government in the UK, we had something called Section 28, which forbade any publicly funded institution to promote acceptance of a homosexual lifestyle. So it really caused inertia, really, in the museum sector in dealing with that. As that's been repealed, we've seen in the last 5 years an explosion of, and I say an explosion because I can think of, say, 10 big events, but, all in the last 2 or 3 years compared to very little work in that field in the previous 10 years. So there has been a kind of real growth. You can see some of that sort of shifting rather than fixed principles that we were perhaps discussing earlier. But I think it comes down to institutional confidence. Some of those institutions have been over here, you'll know better than me, but high-profile controversies that where institutions have got their fingers burnt and have then taken a much more safe position and been scared of doing stuff. Others really thinking very thoughtfully, strategically, very carefully about how they can tackle these subjects in ways which do build support amongst different constituencies and don't result in a kind of, a big blow-up that then restricts experimentation. It'd be great to talk to you about that more. Thank you.
Time for one more question.
I'm interested in your comment about public confidence in museums and how that ties in with social with activism. In the U.S., certainly the big study on history museums is The Presence of the Past by Rosenzweig and Thelen, which argues that indeed the public trusts museums more than their grandmothers. But the problem is that they trust museums because there's no mediation, there's no interpretation, and I would argue no activism either. So how do you reconcile that? I know there have been studies done now in Canada and Australia. I haven't seen the results to see if there's similarities or differences among, I think, getting again into this comparative dimension about something like this. But that issue of public perception that all we're doing is putting objects out for visitors to engage in on their own terms, and our sense that we are interpreting and engaging and are activists in the way that we approach our work.
Thank you. I think there are quite marked similarities, indeed, on the international dimensions on those studies. I certainly know really very, very similar findings, I think, from US and UK on trust in cultural institutions and the reasons for that. I suppose, my title was headed, has the word activism in the title. Of course, none of the 9 projects said that and used that. That's in a sense a professional discussion. And sometimes, the big in-depth evaluation that we did of those 9 projects, the vast majority of people, some people were surprised, but many people really welcomed that, a really challenging idea, something which made them think differently, and enjoyed seeing that relevance, that vibrancy in museums. Others were less cautious, were more cautious about that, did not like finding some of the material that they did. But actually, a lot of it was kind of woven in, if you like, catching people unawares, and was designed, it's all based on rigorous scholarly research into the collections. When we did that story with Stumper Dryden, the fisherman, people would go into that. They didn't come out thinking, oh, I've been told what to think about disabled people. My prejudices have been challenged. But what they did take away from that was what an interesting story that was of somebody who was clearly economically active, a vibrant part of the community that is photographed in amongst his peers. That is an unusual image. And I think that's as far as we got in explaining to visitors. We said it's quite unusual to have this kind of image. And then we went in telling everybody about Stumper Dryden's life and what he did. And some of that was all factually accurate and based on scholarly research. But in doing so, just challenge that misleading view of disabled people as always recipients of charity, as economically inactive. Because there you had this historic story about somebody who challenged that trend. So in a sense, it is slightly flying under the radar, but I feel, and it is challenging work, but I think that sort of, the projects we've done here are unlikely to undermine trust in our institutions simply because they are balanced and well thought out. We brought in debates. We didn't tell people you must think this way, you must think that way. We just exposed them to alternative, more progressive ways of thinking and encouraged debate in that area. I'm sure there's areas where we could have been more subtle. It was a learning process for all of us involved in all of the museums. But I would hope, and certainly the evaluation that we did, people said there should be more of this kind of work. It's been really interesting. There was lots of comments which expressed support for museums being places to discuss those issues because they are trusted resources that that idea of them being unconstructed and unbiased is still really quite strong, even in the where we've done this kind of work. But it is absolutely a challenge, and I think there's a danger in getting it wrong or doing quite clunky, quite unsubtle forms of interpretation, which are likely to challenge visitors in a way that means they no longer are supportive of what we do.